Okay, so I want to show you the parts of a flower. A flower is a reproductive structure in a type of plant called an angiosperm, and it just means a plant that produces flowers for reproduction. There are other types of plants such as gymnosperms, and those you are familiar with as mostly your pine trees and things like that, and they use cones instead of flowers for sexual reproduction. So let's go over the parts of the flower, and then we'll discuss how they kind of work together. So there's a male part and a female part of a flower. A male part is called a stamen, and a female part is called a pistil. And so some flowers have both male and female parts and are called perfect flowers, such as this. Some flowers are not perfect flowers, and they might have male parts or they might have female parts. Some flowers need to find other flowers to reproduce, and some can reproduce by themselves. In order for reproduction to happen, the first thing that has to happen is pollination has to happen. So all of these male reproductive structures, and this one has 5 of them, are made up of 2 parts, an anther and a filament. The anther is where the male sex cell, the sperm, are produced. And the sperm is encapsulated in a structure called pollen. You may be familiar with pollen if you get a lot of allergies in springtime. Pollen is a way for the male sex cell to get transferred from one flower to another, or from the male flower part to the female flower part. It can be transferred from wind, or it sometimes needs insects, and that's why bees, hummingbirds, and other types of animals are very, very important. And before we get into how this reproduction works, I'd like to say that, these other parts of the flower, such as these things here, they're called petals, and they are colorful, they are bright, they are beautiful, and they often smell nice because they're trying to attract animals to them. Okay? So this other part down here called a sepal, which looks like a leaf, is not a leaf. It's actually a protective part of the flower. It protects the petals and the male and female reproductive parts that are inside. So when a plant is not ready to reproduce, oftentimes the flowers will be developing or will be held inside the sepals. Sometimes flowers that are looking for animals during the day will open up during the day when it's warm and sunny, and then when it cools down, they'll close up at night and be protected for the nighttime in those sepals. So again, pollination is the transfer of pollen from the anther, the male reproductive part, to the stigma, the female reproductive part. Stigmas are sticky, so when the pollen lands here, it will stick to the stigma. And once that happens, we have pollination. The next part is, now that we have pollination, how does fertilization happen? So this is a really nice slide for showing that. So in this case, we're looking at an apple tree, and an apple tree, like most angiosperms or all angiosperms, will produce flowers. But it doesn't matter whether you're an oak tree, a maple tree, a pear tree. Sometimes the fruits are very obvious and sometimes they're not. An apple's a nice one because we all know what an apple looks like, nice big fruit. And so what happens before the fruit forms, you have to have a flower. You have to have pollination, and you have to have fertilization, and then the fruit forms. So you have a flower on a tree, and if you look here, there's a nice magnification of one of the male reproductive structures. And at the end of this male reproductive structure, you have the anther. And the anther produces the pollen. And inside the pollen, as we've said, is the male reproductive structure, the sperm cell. So, however, wind or air, the pollen gets transferred over to the stigma of another flower, or sometimes animals like bees. It'll get on the stigma of the female reproductive structure, and now pollination has happened. So now it's time for reproduction. Once the pollen grains land on the sticky stigma, the pollen grains will release what's called a pollen tube, okay, down the style of the female reproductive structure, okay? And so once it gets down here, it goes down into the ovary, the other female reproductive structure, okay? And it wants to connect with an ovule. And these ovules inside here contain the eggs. Once the sperm reaches the egg, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about a plant or any kind of animal, even a human animal, you have fertilization, okay? And just so we're clear what fertilization is, you have half the genetic material inside the sperm, you have half the genetic material inside the egg, and when the egg and the sperm fuse together, you now have what's called an embryo. That means a new organism, usually a single cell or so, or that's able to now multiply and divide many times over to form a new organism. Because this embryo has all the genetic information of the species, whether you're a human, a plant, or anything else. In the case of a plant, once fertilization happens, this ovule develops into a seed, okay? And inside the seed is the embryo, which we just talked about. Once that happens, once you have an embryo, the fruit will form, the ovule will ripen, will become a ripened fruit, and inside that fruit will be the seeds. And the seeds, as we've said, contain the embryo. So this whole fruit, along with the seeds, will get transferred. Sometimes animals will eat them, travel for miles, and then deposit the seeds. Sometimes the fruits will just fall to the ground and roll a little bit, and sometimes they'll be carried by wind and other things, or eaten by birds and travel for great distances. However it happens, this fruit will then transfer these seeds, and these seeds will grow into a new plant. Now, you might be wondering why we have the fruit. Why can't we just have the seed? Sometimes you just have a seed, and inside the seed is some of the necessary materials, some food to start the plant growing. But it's nice to have this fruit because the fruit will decay all around the seed, and that will provide extra nutrients and things in the ground. And the other advantage is that if an animal needs to eat this fruit to live, the seeds are not easily digestible. Again, it's another way to get movement of organisms and create new populations in different places. Any questions on that? Real quick, there are ways we divide angiosperms, and one of the ways we have them is if they're monocots or dicots. Monocots have one cotyledon, which is one seed leaf inside their seeds, and sometimes dicots have two cotyledons, two seed leaves. Monocots have parallel veins in their leaves. Dicots have branching veins. In the stems, monocots have these vascular bundles where the bundles are scattered throughout the stem. These are oftentimes in your herbaceous plants, your green soft stem plants, whereas vascular bundles arranged in a ring are often found in your woody stems, whether it's a bush or a tree. And then the last thing is the flowers. The flowers have 3 parts in monocots, 3 sepals, 3 petals, whereas they have 4 or 5 parts inside the dicots. And so that's just the idea that we have levels of organization of living things, right? 7, we discussed this, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, all of those different categories of classifying organisms, and certainly domain at the top. All right, so that's a quick explanation of the reproductive parts of a flower and how flowers work. Thank you.